Hey guys, tonight we're stepping carefully into one of the strangest corners of medieval life. A place so grim, so uncomfortable, and so quietly unsettling that most people preferred not to think about it at all. We're talking about the lives of medieval executioners, not the dramatic hooded figures from movies, not the cartoon villains swinging axes with a grin, but real people who lived ordinary lives while carrying out extraordinary violence as their job. If you've ever wondered who actually performed medieval executions, how they lived, where they slept, or what it did to a person to be permanently branded as society's necessary monster, this one's for you. Before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of slow, strange history. Drop a comment to tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, let the world quiet down, and settle in. Tonight's story isn't about justice or cruelty alone. It's about duty, stigma, skill, and the heavy silence that followed the fall of an axe. The crowd gathered early, long before the sun had properly decided what kind of day it was going to be. Not because they were eager, exactly, but because executions were events, and events had rules. You showed up. You stood where you were told. You watched. On a summer day in 1540, Tower Hill filled with that familiar, uneasy energy, as Thomas Cromwell, once one of the most powerful men in England, was led toward the block. People had seen executions before. Many of them. Hangings, beheadings, burnings. Death itself was not the shock. What mattered was how it happened. Because in the medieval and early modern mind, an execution was not meant to be messy, uncertain, or improvisational. It was meant to be precise, final, clean. Everyone present that day carried an unspoken expectation. The axe would fall once, maybe twice, at worst. The head would separate. The body would slump. The ritual would be complete. Justice would feel finished. Instead, the first blow failed, and then another. Contemporary chronicler Edward Hall recorded it with barely contained disgust, describing how Cromwell so patiently suffered the stroke of the axe by a ragged and butcherly miser which very ungoodly performed the office. Notice where the horror landed. Not on the fact that a man was dying, not even on the violence itself. The outrage was directed at the executioner's failure to do it properly. This reaction tells you everything about how medieval people understood execution. It was not supposed to feel like chaos. It was not supposed to look like cruelty for cruelty's sake. A botched beheading was seen as a violation of order. The crown had spoken. The law had decided. The executioner's role was to translate judgment into reality with professional efficiency. When that failed, the crowd did not see extended suffering as justice being harsher. They saw it as incompetence, almost sacrilege. Public executions were not spontaneous acts of violence. They were carefully staged rituals, layered with meaning. The scaffold was positioned deliberately. The time of day mattered. The presence of officials mattered. The condemned often spoke final words, not because mercy was expected, but because the performance required closure. The executioner stood at the center of this ritual, not as a sadist, but as a technician. His job was to make death look inevitable, controlled, and authoritative. When the axe missed, that illusion shattered. Suddenly the execution did not feel like justice descending from above. It felt human, too human. The crowd saw hesitation, miscalculation, muscle strain, fear, and that was deeply unsettling. Medieval society depended on the idea that law was something larger than any individual. A clean execution reinforced that belief. A botched one suggested that justice itself could fumble. Crowds reacted viscerally to these failures, sometimes with gasps, sometimes with groans, sometimes with outright fury. There are accounts of people shouting insults at executioners who took too many strikes, not because they sympathized with the condemned, but because the executioner was embarrassing the system. In some regions, folk belief held that if a condemned person survived multiple blows, it might mean divine intervention. God, perhaps, was objecting, and that was dangerous thinking. Authorities wanted executions to look unquestionable. This is why skill mattered more than mercy. Mercy could be granted before the scaffold, pardons existed, sentences could be commuted, but once the ritual began, mercy was no longer the goal. Precision was. A swift death was not considered kindness. It was considered professionalism. The executioner who struck cleanly was praised quietly, even if he was still avoided afterward. The one who failed became a focus of communal anger. Execution manuals, customs, and unwritten rules reflected this obsession with control. In many regions there was an accepted number of strikes for beheading, often 3. Anything beyond that crossed from tragic to intolerable. Crowds had long memories for these moments. A single botched execution could stain a city's reputation, suggesting weak justice or divine displeasure. Chroniclers did not forget. They recorded failures in detail, preserving them as warnings. The condemned themselves often understood this logic. It was not uncommon for prisoners to pray not for survival, but for a steady hand. Some even paid executioners in advance, offering coins for a sharp blade and a decisive strike. This practice was not seen as bribery in the modern sense, but as a practical arrangement. Everyone involved wanted the ritual to conclude smoothly. The family wanted dignity. The crowd wanted closure. The authorities wanted order. The scaffold, then, was less about death and more about reassurance. It reassured the living that rules existed, that crimes had consequences, and that the world still made sense. When executions went wrong, that reassurance evaporated. The crowd was forced to confront the fact that death could be clumsy, drawn out, and uncertain. That fear lingered long after the body was removed. It is important to understand that medieval people were not numb to suffering. They lived with it constantly, but they categorized it carefully. Suffering that fit within expected boundaries was acceptable. Suffering that spilled beyond them felt wrong. A clean execution signaled that suffering had been measured and contained. A botched one suggested excess, disorder. Something had gone off script. This is why accounts of failed executions often emphasize patience on the part of the condemned. Writers pointed out how calmly Cromwell endured the blows, not to praise his courage alone, but to highlight the executioner's failure. The victim behaved as expected. The system did not. That inversion disturbed people deeply. Public executions were also educational. They taught lessons about obedience, hierarchy, and authority. But lessons only work when the demonstration is clear. A fumbling execution taught the wrong lesson. It suggested that authority could falter, that law depended on fallible hands, and that realization was far more unsettling than death itself. So when people gathered at scaffolds, they were not hoping for bloodshed. They were hoping for resolution, a beginning, a middle, and a clean end. The axe was supposed to fall like punctuation, closing a sentence written by judges and kings. When it failed, the story dragged on in an uncomfortable, unplanned way. And it is here, in this tension between expectation and reality, that the deeper story begins. Because once society demanded perfection from the act of execution, it quietly began demanding something impossible from the person who performed it. Long before there was a scaffold set in a town square, long before crowds gathered to watch a single man raise an axe or tighten a rope, justice in medieval Europe looked very different. It was quieter, more personal, and far less theatrical. There was no permanent figure whose job it was to kill on behalf of the law, no hooded professional waiting in the wings. Instead, justice lived inside families, clans, and communities, negotiated face-to-face and enforced by people who knew each other's names, histories, and grudges. In the early medieval world, roughly the centuries following the collapse of Roman authority in Western Europe, law was not centralized. There was no single state apparatus standing above society, issuing punishments through uniform systems. Power was fractured, local, and deeply tied to kinship. A crime was not primarily an offense against an abstract idea of the law. It was an offense against a person, a family, or a group, and the response reflected that worldview. One of the most important concepts shaping this system was Vergilde, literally man price. Vergilde assigned a monetary value to a human life based on social status. If someone was killed, the issue was not automatically resolved through execution. Instead, compensation was expected. The killer, or more often the killer's family, owed payment to the victim's family. This payment was not symbolic. It was detailed, negotiated, and enforced by social pressure. Failing to pay was not merely rude, it was dangerous. The guilt existed because early medieval societies understood violence as something that could spiral endlessly. Killings led to revenge killings, which led to feuds that could last generations. Compensation was a way to stop the blood from spreading. Paying the guild acknowledged wrongdoing while allowing both sides to step back from total destruction. It was not mercy in a modern sense, it was damage control. Blood feuds, however, remained an ever-present threat. If compensation was refused, inadequate, or dishonestly offered, the victim's family was often expected to take matters into their own hands. Revenge was not viewed as criminal behavior, it was a duty. A failure to respond could be interpreted as weakness, inviting further harm. Violence, in this context, was regulated but personal. Justice did not descend from above. It moved horizontally, through families balancing honor, fear, and survival. In this world, there was a little need for a permanent executioner. Death sentences were rare, and when they occurred, they were handled case by case. A local leader, chieftain, or king might proclaim judgment, but carrying it out was another matter entirely. The act itself could fall to soldiers, retainers, or even the injured party's kin. The killing was an extension of conflict resolution, not a specialized profession. Early medieval law codes reflect this absence clearly. Many of them describe penalties, fines, and compensations in great detail, but remain vague or silent about who exactly performs an execution. The law might state that a thief should be hanged or a murderer put to death, but it does not name a specific official responsible for swinging the rope or wielding the blade. The assumption was that someone present would do it. Authority was diffuse. Responsibility was shared or simply imposed on whoever was available. Judges existed, but their role was limited. They were declarers of outcomes, not enforcers. A judge announced what the law required, often after consulting elders, priests, or community leaders. Once the sentence was spoken, the judge's involvement largely ended. He did not step forward to perform violence. That separation mattered. Justice was spoken by authority, but executed by circumstance. This separation was reinforced by religious influence. The early medieval church promoted ideas of penance, confession, and spiritual correction over physical punishment. Trials by ordeal or combat were common. Trials by ordeal or combat were common not because people enjoyed cruelty, but because they believed God would intervene directly. If a person survived boiling water or won a duel, divine judgment had spoken. Human hands could step aside. Execution, when it occurred, often followed perceived divine signs rather than judicial certainty. When executions did happen, they were often political or military. Prisoners taken during rebellions might be killed en masse. Enemies of a king might be executed publicly as warnings. These acts were carried out by soldiers or guards, not by a permanent specialist. Killing in this context was part of warfare, not law enforcement. Even in Anglo-Saxon England, where hanging was a known punishment, the responsibility could fall to a sheriff, a reeve, or even the accuser. Law codes describe outcomes, not careers. No one was trained exclusively to kill. No one inherited the role. Execution was an event, not an occupation. Communities sometimes struggled to find anyone willing to perform the act. Killing, even when sanctioned, carried spiritual and social weight. To solve this, authorities occasionally coerced participation. There are accounts of condemned criminals being offered a grim bargain: carry out executions in the future, or face death immediately. Accepting such an offer meant survival, but at the cost of social death. These arrangements were temporary, improvised, and deeply unstable. They highlight how undesirable the task was, even before stigma became formalized. In Scandinavia and parts of Northern Europe, similar practices emerged. A man spared from execution might be forced into service as the community's designated killer, but this did not yet create a profession. It created a placeholder. someone who existed outside ordinary life, doing what others refused to do, until circumstances changed again. Crucially, these early systems did not see execution as a central pillar of justice. It was one tool among many, and often a last resort. Most disputes ended in fines, exile, or negotiated settlements. Death removed labor, disrupted families, and invited retaliation. It was expensive in ways money could not fix. This absence of a permanent execution role shaped how people thought about punishment. Violence was not abstracted. When someone died, everyone knew who swung the sword or pulled the rope. Responsibility could not be hidden behind an office or a mask. This closeness restrained excess. It also meant that executions, when they occurred, carried emotional weight for entire communities. As towns grew and political authority slowly centralized, this system began to strain. Urban life brought strangers together. Kinship networks weakened. Crimes became less personal and more anonymous. A theft was no longer just a dispute between families. It was a disruption of public order. Judges could still proclaim sentences, but now the consequences affected larger populations. The old methods struggled to scale. Blood feuds were impractical in crowded cities. Verguild made less sense when offenders and victims had no shared history. Compensation could not easily repair harm done to an entire community. Gradually, the idea took hold that crime was not just a personal wrong, but an offense against collective order. At this stage, however, the solution was not yet the executioner. Instead, authorities experimented. Soldiers carried out punishments. Guards enforced sentences. Outsiders were pressured into violent tasks. The role remained unstable, shifting, and poorly defined. There was still no consensus that killing should belong to a single, specialized figure. What existed instead was a growing gap. Judges could speak with authority, but no one embodied the physical enforcement of that authority consistently. Executions were still expected to happen when declared, but the mechanics were unreliable. Each case required improvisation. Each death carried the risk of disorder, resentment, or religious anxiety. This gap mattered because medieval society increasingly demanded visible justice. As populations grew and rulers asserted control, law needed to be seen, not just heard. A proclaimed sentence that was not efficiently enforced weakened authority. A punishment carried out clumsily undermined it. The expectation of order was rising, but the tools to enforce it had not yet caught up. And in that tension, something new began to take shape. Not yet a profession, not yet a fixed identity, but a growing recognition that justice required not just words, but reliable hands to translate those words into action. Justice in the medieval mind was not something humans fully trusted themselves to deliver. Courts could speak, elders could argue, families could feud, but beneath all of it lingered a deep, almost anxious belief that true judgment belonged elsewhere, to God. And if God truly governed the world, then surely he would intervene when it mattered most. This belief didn't sit quietly in churches or sermons. It shaped entire legal systems. It decided who lived, who suffered, and who walked away untouched, convinced of their righteousness. When evidence was unclear, when witnesses contradicted one another, when guilt felt slippery and uncertain, medieval society often turned away from human reasoning altogether. Instead of asking who was most convincing, they asked who God favored. And the answer, they believed, could be revealed through ordeal. A trial by ordeal was not meant to be punishment. At least not in theory. It was meant to be a test. A moment where the divine stepped in and nudged the outcome one way or the other. The human role was simply to set the stage and then watch carefully for signs. If someone survived, healed, or emerged unscathed, innocence had been proven. If they suffered, God had spoken. One of the most common ordeals involved fire. The accused might be required to carry a red-hot iron a certain distance, or walk barefoot across heated plowshares. Afterward, their wounds were bandaged and sealed. Several days later, the bandages were removed in the presence of clergy and community leaders. If the wound was healing cleanly, God had protected the innocent. If it festered or worsened, guilt was revealed. The body itself became a message board for divine judgment. Water offered another option. In an ordeal by cold water, the accused was bound and lowered into a body of water. The logic was unsettling but firm. Pure water as God's creation would reject the guilty and accept the innocent. Floating was bad. Sinking was good, sometimes too good. Drowning was considered a tragic but spiritually valid outcome. The verdict still stood. Hot water ordeals followed similar reasoning. The accused plunged a hand into boiling liquid to retrieve an object. Healing meant innocence. Infection meant guilt. Pain was unavoidable either way. That wasn't the point. Pain was simply the language God was expected to use. These ordeals were terrifying, but they made sense within the medieval worldview. If God controlled nature, then nature could testify. Fire, water, flesh, and time itself were witnesses far more trustworthy than humans with grudges or poor memories. The ordeal transformed uncertainty into clarity, even if the clarity came at a horrific cost. Trial by combat operated on the same principle, though with a more dramatic flair. When two parties disputed guilt and no clear resolution emerged, they could fight, not out of rage, but ritual. The winner was believed to have God on their side. Strength, endurance, and survival became proof of righteousness. The weaker party did not simply lose the fight, they lost divine favor. Combat could be fought between the accused and the accuser, or through champions acting on their behalf. A frail noblewoman might hire a seasoned fighter to represent her. A powerful lord might do the same. This wasn't cheating, it was accepted practice. God, after all, would guide the outcome regardless of who swung the weapon. Importantly, these combats were governed by strict rules. They took place in designated areas, overseen by officials and clergy. Weapons were standardized. Oaths were sworn. This was not chaos. It was theater infused with belief, a structured plea for divine intervention. The church played a complicated role in all of this. On one hand, clergy were deeply embedded in ordeals. Priests blessed the irons, sanctified the water, sealed the wounds. Their presence lent legitimacy. On the other hand, church doctrine increasingly struggled with the implications. If God truly judged every ordeal, what did it mean when outcomes felt arbitrary or cruel? What did it say about divine justice when innocent people suffered? By the early High Middle Ages, discomfort was growing. Church leaders began to argue that forcing God to perform miracles on demand bordered on blasphemy. Faith, they suggested, should not be tested like a tool. It should be trusted. Gradually, ecclesiastical authorities withdrew their support. Clergy refused to bless ordeals. Without priestly involvement, the rituals lost their authority. This withdrawal had enormous consequences. Ordeals had been the backbone of proof. Without them, courts were left with testimony, confession, and judgment. Human judgment, something medieval society trusted far less. Yet even as ordeals faded, the belief behind them did not disappear. The idea that God actively intervened in justice lingered. Execution, when it occurred, was still framed as a moral act rather than a mechanical one. Death sentences were rare, not because medieval people were gentle, but because they were cautious. Killing someone without divine certainty risked condemning the wrong soul. That was a spiritual danger far greater than letting a guilty person live. Executions, therefore, carried symbolic weight. They were not routine punishments. They were statements. They said something about order, sin, and cosmic balance. A death sentence suggested that guilt was undeniable, that all other avenues had failed, and that divine will aligned with human judgment. This is why early medieval executions often followed rebellion, treason, or acts that threatened the entire social structure. Crimes against individuals could be settled. Crimes against God's order could not. The rarity of execution reinforced its power. When someone was killed by the law, people paid attention. It was not just a legal event, it was a spiritual one. The community gathered not merely to witness death, but to observe meaning. Was the condemned calm or defiant? Did the weather shift? Did the body fall cleanly? Every detail could be interpreted as a sign. In this context, violence was not yet technical. There was no obsession with efficiency or precision. What mattered was legitimacy. Was the act justified in the eyes of heaven? Was it morally clean? The mechanics of how death occurred mattered less than what it represented. But as ordeals disappeared and combat fell out of favor, this system faced a crisis. If God no longer provided obvious signs, humans had to fill the gap. Courts needed new ways to establish certainty. Punishments needed to be enforced consistently. Justice could no longer rely entirely on belief alone. And slowly, almost reluctantly, medieval society began to accept that if God was silent, humans would have to speak more loudly themselves. When execution did happen in the early medieval world, it did not belong to a profession. There was no office, no uniform, no specialist waiting in the wings. Death sentences existed, but the act of carrying them out was handled in the most improvised way imaginable. Whoever had authority, proximity, or obligation did the killing. Justice at this stage did not yet have hands of its own. In many cases, the task fell to soldiers. Armies already dealt in violence, and when a ruler needed someone put to death, a man with a weapon and obedience was the simplest solution. Battlefield justice blurred easily into legal punishment. Prisoners taken during rebellions or wars were often executed immediately after judgment, sometimes without ceremony at all. A commander might order it, and a soldier would step forward. The act looked less like law and more like an extension of combat, even when the victim was bound and helpless. These executions were not delicate. They were fast, brutal, and often public only by accident. A sword stroke, a hanging from a tree, a shove off a cliff. The goal was not precision, it was removal. Someone deemed dangerous or defiant was eliminated, and the community moved on. Whether the death was clean or messy mattered little, because no one had built expectations around technique yet. Local officials also played this role. Sheriffs, reeves, bailiffs, or whatever authority figure existed in a given region might be responsible for carrying out a sentence. These men were administrators, tax collectors, messengers of the court. Execution was simply another unpleasant duty added to the list. If a hanging was ordered, the sheriff might supervise it, assist in it, or perform it himself. There was no sense that this required special training beyond basic competence and nerve. Sometimes the responsibility fell even closer to home. In societies still shaped by family-based justice, the victim's relatives could be expected to carry out the punishment. A murderer might be handed over to the family he had wronged. The killing, in that case, was not just legal, it was personal. This blurred the line between justice and vengeance, but in the early medieval mindset, the two were not always distinct. The law sanctioned what the family had every emotional reason to do. This practice carried a grim logic. If the crime had shattered a household, then the household should be allowed to close the wound. The state, such as it was, merely supervised the exchange. Blood paid for blood. No intermediary was required. Political executions followed a similar pattern, though on a larger scale. When rulers crushed rebellions, executions were often carried out by troops en masse. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, could be killed in a single campaign of reprisal. These deaths were meant to send a message, not to demonstrate fairness or restraint. The spectacle came from numbers, not ceremony. Heads might be displayed, bodies left unburied. The brutality was intentional. In these moments, execution was indistinguishable from terror. It was meant to overwhelm, to discourage resistance through fear. No one worried about professionalism. The authority of the ruler was the only justification needed. The killing itself was simply proof that power still existed. Because executions were handled this way, inconsistency was the norm. One person might be hanged, another beheaded, another beaten to death. Outcomes depended on who was present, what tools were available, and how angry the enforcers felt that day. There was no standard method, no shared expectation of how death should look. This unpredictability extended to the condemned themselves. A person facing execution could not prepare for a known process. There was no established ritual to rely on, no familiar sequence of events. Some were killed immediately after sentencing, others waited days or weeks. Some were granted final prayers, others were dragged out without warning. The experience varied wildly from place to place. Crowds, when they gathered at all, did so more out of curiosity than ritual participation. An execution might draw attention simply because violence was rare, not because it was choreographed. People watched because something unusual was happening, not because they expected a particular performance. And this lack of structure had consequences. Botched executions were common, but they did not yet provoke outrage in the way they would later. A messy death was unfortunate, but not scandalous. No one blamed a lack of skill, because no skill was presumed. If someone suffered, that suffering was folded into the punishment itself. At the same time, this informality made executions unstable symbols of authority. Without consistency, it was harder for rulers to use death as a reliable message. One execution might terrify a region, another might inspire sympathy for the condemned. A poorly handled killing could undermine the legitimacy of the sentence rather than reinforce it. As legal systems slowly became more centralized, this problem became harder to ignore. Courts issued sentences, but the execution of those sentences remained uneven. Justice spoke in words but acted in improvisation. The gap between judgment and enforcement widened. Communities began to notice patterns. Certain soldiers were better at killing cleanly. Certain officials were more decisive. Others hesitated, botched the act, or recoiled at the final moment. These differences mattered, even if they were not yet named as such. People remembered bad executions. They talked about them. Stories spread. And with those stories came discomfort. Not about death itself, but about disorder. A society increasingly invested in law could not rely forever on whoever happened to be holding the rope. If execution was to represent authority rather than chaos, it needed shape. It needed reliability. It needed someone who would step forward every time, do the job the same way, and bear the weight of it consistently. But that realization had not yet produced a solution. For now, killing remained a task passed from hand to hand, an obligation, not an identity, a duty performed and then discarded. And in that uncertainty, something else began to form quietly in the background. The idea that death, if it was going to be used by the law, might eventually need a specialist. The idea did not begin as a profession. It began as a bargain, a desperate, grim, deeply medieval bargain whispered at the edge of the scaffold. When a community needed someone to kill, and no one wanted to step forward, they looked to the person who already stood condemned. If death was inevitable anyway, why not trade it for something worse than death, something longer lasting? The logic was brutally efficient. A man already sentenced to die had nothing left to lose. His life in the eyes of the law was already forfeit. If he agreed to carry out executions for the community, he might be spared the noose. But the cost of survival was absolute separation from ordinary life. He would live, yes, but as something altered. A man allowed to breathe, but not to belong. This was the origin of the executioner in many parts of medieval Europe. Not hired, not trained, converted. The phrase appears again and again in records and chronicles, sometimes directly, sometimes implied. Swap the rope for the blade, swap the gallows for the axe. The condemned was offered a choice that was barely a choice at all. In Scandinavia, this practice appears with particular clarity. Late early medieval and early high medieval sources describe towns and rural districts where the role of executioner was filled almost exclusively by men who had once faced execution themselves. A thief, a murderer, a repeat offender, someone already marked by the community as disposable. These men were spared not because of mercy, but because their continued existence could serve a purpose. One account, preserved by later historians, describes a Swedish thief standing beneath the gallows in the 15th century. The noose was already prepared. The crowd had gathered. At the last moment, the man begged for mercy and offered himself for the task no one wanted. He would become the town's executioner. The authorities debated briefly, then agreed. His sentence was commuted. He was cut down from the rope. But the pardon came with conditions that ensured he would never truly escape his punishment. His body was branded. The marks identified him forever as both criminal and executioner. Shame burned into flesh. In some regions, especially in Scandinavia, ears were cut or mutilated to make the transformation visible. This was not hidden stigma. It was deliberate, permanent signaling. The man was alive, but he was not allowed to disappear back into society. His body told his story before he ever opened his mouth. The branding served a purpose. It prevented reintegration. A pardoned executioner could not simply move away and pretend his past no longer existed. His appearance announced his role wherever he went. He carried the community's violence on his skin. In effect, the town outsourced its moral contamination onto a single body. This was not kindness, it was containment. The executioner was spared death, so that death could continue to be administered without respectable hands becoming dirty. By turning an already disgraced person into the instrument of punishment, the community preserved its own sense of moral cleanliness. The executioner, in this early form, was not respected. He was tolerated. He existed in a strange legal limbo. He was no longer fully criminal, but never fully forgiven. He was useful, and usefulness was the only protection he had. These origin stories explain why executioners were so often described as living exiles. They resided physically near the community but were conceptually outside it. Their survival depended entirely on continued service. Refusal to perform an execution could mean death, because the pardon was conditional. Mercy could be revoked. This also explains the obedience recorded in later sources. Early executioners were rarely rebels. They complied, sometimes with grim seriousness, sometimes with visible resignation. The alternative was not freedom, it was the scaffold. In some cases, the recruitment process was even more coercive. Chronic anecdotes suggest that authorities would threaten multiple condemned prisoners, offering survival to the one who agreed first. The role was assigned through fear, not consent. Once accepted, it could not be escaped. The community then enforced separation with remarkable consistency. Executioners recruited this way were often forced to live outside town walls or at the edge of settlements. They were prohibited from certain spaces. They were avoided physically. Contact with them was considered dangerous, not in a medical sense, but in a symbolic one. Touching the executioner meant touching death itself. Yet despite this exclusion, executioners were watched closely. Their behavior mattered. A failure to perform executions efficiently could anger crowds and officials alike. The executioner's body was expendable, but the function he served was essential. This paradox created a strange pressure. He was expected to kill well, but never be accepted for doing so. Importantly, at this stage, the stigma had not yet fully crystallized into a rigid social caste. These early executioners were isolated, but not yet hereditary figures. Their children were not automatically condemned to follow them. That would come later. For now, the executioner was an individual solution to a communal problem. The psychological toll of this arrangement is difficult to reconstruct, but hints remain. A man spared death only to live as an object of fear and avoidance, inhabited a strange mental space. He was alive because the community needed him, not because it valued him. His identity was built entirely around the act that had nearly killed him. Some adapted by embracing the role with grim professionalism. Others appeared withdrawn, silent, barely visible except when summoned. There are hints in later folklore that some early executioners became deeply religious, seeking spiritual justification for the violence they carried out under compulsion. The community, meanwhile, benefited enormously. Executions could now be carried out without forcing ordinary men to step forward. The moral burden was concentrated. Blood was spilled by someone already considered unclean. The crowd could watch without feeling complicit. This system did not emerge because medieval people were crueler than later societies. It emerged because they were intensely concerned with moral boundaries. Killing was necessary but contaminating. Someone had to absorb that contamination, so others did not have to. By recruiting the unwanted, medieval communities solved two problems at once. They avoided performing executions themselves, and they reinforced social boundaries by creating a figure who embodied exclusion. The executioner became a living reminder of what happened to those who crossed the line too far. Over time, this solution proved too effective to abandon. As legal systems became more structured and executions more frequent, communities needed executioners not occasionally but regularly. And once the role existed, it began to harden. What started as a bargain with the condemned slowly transformed into something more permanent. But at this point, the executioner was still a man pulled from the edge of death, allowed to live in exchange for becoming something the community could never fully accept: a necessary presence, a tolerated monster, a human boundary marker between law and blood. The medieval world did not trust memory, it trusted flesh. If a man was meant to be set apart forever, his body had to say so without explanation. Words could be denied, stories could be rewritten. Faces, however, were permanent documents. Once a condemned criminal accepted the role of executioner, survival came with an immediate transformation, not a symbolic one, a physical one. Authorities across Europe ensured that the man who now wielded the tools of death would never again pass unnoticed. His body became a warning label. One of the most common methods was ear removal. Not a complete amputation in every case, but enough damage to make the loss unmistakable. An ear cut short, an ear notched, an ear removed entirely. It served several purposes at once. It marked the executioner as altered, it prevented disguise, and it ensured that even from a distance, people could recognize what he was. Ears mattered, because medieval society read bodies instinctively. Before literacy was widespread, physical signs carried meaning. Missing ears already signaled criminality. Thieves, repeat offenders, and oath-breakers were often punished this way. By removing an executioner's ear, authorities fused two identities together: criminal and enforcer. He was spared execution, but never absolved. Facial branding went even further. In some regions, hot irons were pressed against cheeks or foreheads, burning symbols into skin that could never be hidden. The marks varied, sometimes letters, sometimes abstract shapes, sometimes symbols representing both crime and office. These brands were not meant to be decorative or ceremonial. They were meant to repel. Branding accomplished what clothing could not. A man could remove a badge. He could change garments. He could flee to another town. But he could not erase iron scars. Even if he left his post, his face followed him. His past was visible at all times. This is why anonymity did not exist for medieval executioners. The later image of the masked headsman is a myth. Masks belong to art and drama, not daily reality. The executioner's identity was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be obvious. In fact, hiding was dangerous. If an executioner attempted to conceal his marks, he risked severe punishment. The marks were not optional. They were legal identifiers. Removing them or disguising them could be interpreted as fraud or escape from one's assigned social function. These markings also reassured the crowd. Public executions were rituals of authority. The community needed to know that the man wielding the axe or tightening the rope was authorized. Visible marks provided legitimacy. They confirmed that this was not murder but justice enacted through a designated vessel. The irony is sharp. The executioner carried the most visible proof of state authority on his body, yet that same body was treated as polluted. The mark that legitimized his actions also condemned him socially. Branding was often performed publicly, or at least semi-publicly. Witnesses ensured the transformation was irreversible. The act itself reinforced the message. This man no longer belonged among ordinary people. He was reshaped into something else. Some sources describe executioners marked with multiple signs, an ear removed, and a brand added. In rare cases, additional mutilations followed if the executioner disobeyed orders or performed poorly. His body became a ledger of compliance and punishment. These practices reveal something important about medieval thinking. Punishment was not complete unless it could be seen. Internal shame meant nothing without external confirmation. To be marked was to be permanently legible to society. The executioner's body became a moving symbol of law's violence. Every scar reminded observers that justice was not abstract. It had weight, pain, and consequences. The executioner embodied that truth so others did not have to. Even clothing reinforced this visibility. While the next chapter will deal with social rules in detail, it is important here to note that physical identifiers often extended beyond flesh. Some executioners were required to wear specific garments during duties, not uniforms in the modern sense, but recognizable items that drew attention rather than deflected it. Yet clothing alone was never trusted. Fabric could tear. Marks could not. The medieval system relied on bodily permanence. What is striking is how little concern there was for psychological impact. The executioner's inner life was irrelevant. The goal was control and clarity. He was not meant to feel redeemed. He was meant to function. Children born to these marked men grew up seeing the consequences of flesh-based justice every day. Even before heredity became formalized, the visual stigma shaped family identity. A father's scars told a story long before he spoke. In some regions, authorities justified these practices as preventative. A visibly marked executioner could not easily commit crimes unnoticed. He could not blend into crowds. His movements were always observed. The mark made surveillance unnecessary. There was also a deeper symbolic logic. Medieval justice often mirrored religious concepts. Sin left marks on the soul. Punishment left marks on the body. The executioner, who dealt in death, carried visible evidence of contamination. These marks were not viewed as cruelty by contemporaries. They were seen as practical necessities. Someone had to perform acts that society found morally dangerous. That person had to be unmistakable. The executioner was not allowed the comfort of invisibility. His presence was meant to unsettle, to remind, to warn. Over time, as the role became more established, the marks became less about recruitment and more about reinforcement. Even when executioners were born into the role, the expectation of visible difference remained. The body still mattered. This fixation on bodily marking explains why executioners rarely appear as anonymous figures in medieval accounts. Chroniclers name them, describe them, point them out. Their physical difference made them memorable. And because they could never disappear into the crowd, they could never fully escape their role. Even in sleep, even in silence, their bodies testified against them. The executioner lived inside a skin that announced his purpose before he acted. A walking proclamation, a scarred guarantee. By marking him so thoroughly, medieval society ensured something crucial. The violence of justice would never feel clean. It would always have a face. By the time medieval towns began to grow upward instead of outward, justice began to harden into something permanent. Villages could rely on memory, reputation, and neighborly enforcement. Cities could not. Too many strangers, too many disputes, too much power concentrated behind walls. The High Middle Ages, roughly the 11th to 13th centuries, marked a turning point. Not because people suddenly became more violent, but because authority became more organized. Kings tightened control. Towns gained charters. Courts stopped improvising and started recording. And with that shift came a problem medieval law could no longer ignore. Punishment needed consistency. Urban courts were different from rural assemblies. In a village, justice might be communal and flexible. In a city, it had to be legible. Sentences were written down. Crimes were categorized. Procedures were formalized. And once death became a regular sentence rather than a rare exception, improvisation stopped being acceptable. Public executions expanded alongside urban courts, not just in number but in purpose. They were no longer merely outcomes. They became demonstrations. A hanging or beheading was not simply about removing a criminal. It was about proving that the court's authority extended all the way to the body. Cities depended on visibility. Their power rested on spectacle. Market squares doubled as judicial stages. Gallows became permanent fixtures. Execution sites were chosen deliberately where crowds gathered. Justice had to be seen working. That visibility created pressure. A failed execution undermined the court. A chaotic execution embarrassed the city. A delayed death suggested weakness, not mercy. Reliability became essential. This is where the system itself began to generate the need for an executioner, not a volunteer, not a desperate substitute, a dedicated role. Urban courts could not risk assigning executions to whoever happened to be available. Soldiers were unreliable. Sheriffs had other duties. Victims' families were emotionally invested. None of these guaranteed consistency, and consistency was now the currency of authority. Cities began to treat execution as a technical act, something that could be done well or poorly, that required skill, repetition, and experience, just like masonry, just like bookkeeping, just like law itself. As capital punishment expanded to include theft, arson, counterfeiting, treason, and heresy, executions became routine rather than exceptional. Routine demands professionals. Legal records from this period reflect the shift. Earlier documents spoke vaguely of punishment carried out. Later ones specify how, where, and by whom. The language sharpens, roles separate. The executioner emerges not because society wanted him, but because the system required him. Law needed an endpoint. Someone had to close the ritual cleanly. Public executions also became more standardized, hanging for common crimes, beheading for elites, burning for heresy. Each method carried symbolic meaning, and symbols only work if they are consistent. The wrong method sent the wrong message. Reliability mattered not only to the condemned, but to the crowd. Spectators were participants in medieval justice. Their belief in the system depended on the performance making sense. Disorder bred doubt. Doubt bred unrest. Cities feared unrest more than cruelty. A clean execution calmed crowds. A botched one inflamed them. Urban authorities understood this quickly. Some town charters begin mentioning payments for execution services. Others specify equipment to be maintained. Axes sharpened, gallows repaired, ropes replaced. This was infrastructure. Death as civic maintenance. The executioner became part of the city's machinery. Not a moral actor, but a functional one. He was expected to perform with precision, not passion. Importantly, this did not yet mean heredity or dynasties. At this stage, the role was still fluid. Some executioners traveled between towns. Others were hired temporarily. But the idea of specialization had taken root. Legal philosophy reinforced the change. The rediscovery of Roman law emphasized the state's responsibility to punish wrongdoing. Justice was no longer purely personal or divine. It was institutional. Executions now represented the city's sovereignty. The executioner's hand was an extension of the court's seal. This also explains why executioners were closely regulated. Their actions reflected directly on the authorities. Too slow, and the city looked cruel. Too sloppy, and it looked incompetent. Too merciful, and it looked weak. The rise of professional executioners was not about bloodlust. It was about predictability. Urban populations demanded order. Merchants wanted safe markets. Guilds wanted stability. Rulers wanted obedience. Public punishment became a tool to deliver all three. As cities competed for prestige, justice became part of civic identity. A well-run execution signaled control. A poorly run one signaled decay. Executioners were therefore supervised carefully. Courts dictated procedures. Magistrates oversaw events. The executioner followed instructions. This shift also reduced randomness. Earlier executions might depend on circumstance. Urban executions followed scripts. Announcements, processions, confessions, sentences, death. Each step mattered. The executioner was responsible for the final act, but the entire structure depended on his reliability. By the late High Middle Ages, many towns could no longer imagine justice without him. He was no longer an emergency solution. He was a standing requirement. And yet, despite this growing necessity, the executioner remained morally distant. Cities needed him but did not integrate him. His usefulness did not translate into acceptance. That tension deepened as the role solidified. The more essential the executioner became, the more carefully he was separated from ordinary civic life. For now, though, what mattered was function. Cities created the executioner because cities created a form of justice that could not tolerate uncertainty. Once law became permanent, death had to become dependable. And once death became dependable, someone had to guarantee it. By the time cities accepted that executions could no longer be improvised, the next step followed naturally. If the act was essential, then the role needed a name. And once it had a name, it needed rules. What began as an ugly necessity hardened into an office. This is where the executioner stopped being a man with a task and became an extension of the law itself. Across medieval Europe, new titles appeared almost simultaneously, each reflecting the same idea. This was no longer random violence, but sanctioned judgment carried out by a designated hand. In German-speaking regions, the word Nachrichter emerged, literally the after-judge. Not the one who decided guilt, but the one who completed judgment. The phrase alone reveals how the role was understood. The executioner was not acting independently. He came after the law had spoken. Another German term, Scharfrichter, meant sharp judge, a reference not to legal authority, but to the blade. It acknowledged that precision, not cruelty, defined competence. A sharp judge was one who executed cleanly, decisively, without error. In France, the word bourreau took hold. Earlier Latin documents had used carnifex, a Roman term for executioner that carried echoes of the ancient empire's bureaucratic violence. Medieval authorities deliberately revived that vocabulary. Roman law had been rediscovered. Roman authority was being imitated. Justice once again wore an official face. Language matters because it signals legitimacy. Once towns began using standardized titles, the role ceased to be ad hoc. It became recognized, recorded, and regulated. City charters from the 13th and 14th centuries increasingly mention the executioner explicitly, not in moral terms, but administrative ones. He appears alongside jailers, court scribes, and watchmen. His presence is noted not because he is feared, but because he must be paid. These documents describe obligations. The executioner must appear when summoned. He must use the prescribed method. He must obey the court's instructions exactly. Deviations were not acts of mercy. They were breaches of contract. The job was formalized through paperwork long before it was formalized through tradition. Contracts followed. Some towns hired executioners permanently. Others retained them on renewable terms. Salaries varied by region, but the principle was consistent. The executioner was compensated not for killing, but for service rendered to the law. Payment structures reveal how the job was conceptualized. Executioners were often paid per task, not per year. A hanging earned one fee, a beheading another. Torture during interrogation added a separate payment. Corporal punishments like whipping or branding had their own rates. This mattered because it placed execution within a transactional framework. The court ordered, the executioner delivered. Compensation followed. In some cities, executioners received a base retainer to ensure availability. In others, they relied entirely on fees. Either way, their income was tied to legal procedure, not personal initiative. The executioner did not decide when someone died. He responded when summoned. This distinction was crucial to medieval legal thinking. Killing without authority was murder. Killing with authority was duty. The executioner's protection came not from secrecy, but from documentation. Orders mattered. Records mattered. The more formal the system became, the more the executioner was shielded by law. He was no longer just tolerated, he was authorized. This authorization was reinforced through ritual. Before executions, sentences were read aloud, names were spoken, crimes were recited. The executioner stood nearby, silent. His presence was not accidental. It showed continuity. Law flowed from judge to body. When the final act came, the executioner did not improvise. He performed what had already been decided. City councils took this seriously. Some towns inspected executioners' tools. Axes had to be sharp. Ropes had to be strong. Equipment was sometimes stored in civic buildings, not private homes. This emphasized that the means of death belonged to the city, not the man. In certain regions, executioners swore oaths similar to other civic officials. These oaths emphasized obedience, precision, and restraint. They promised not to act out of anger, not to prolong suffering unnecessarily, not to exceed the sentence. This does not mean executions were gentle. It means they were controlled. The executioner's authority was narrow by design. He could not alter a sentence. He could not spare a condemned person. He could not choose methods. His power ended where obedience began, and yet his role was indispensable. Courts without executioners could pronounce death, but not enforce it. Authority without enforcement was theater. The executioner made it real. As cities expanded, their legal reach expanded with them. Jurisdictions overlapped, conflicts arose. Who had the right to execute? Whose gallows mattered? The answer increasingly depended on who employed the executioner. Having one signaled possession of high justice, the authority to impose capital punishment. It was a political statement as much as a legal one. This is why some towns fought fiercely to maintain their own executioner rather than borrowing one. Borrowing implied dependence. Employing implied sovereignty. In border regions, executioners sometimes served multiple jurisdictions under carefully negotiated agreements. These arrangements were documented meticulously. Death, after all, was not something to be handled casually. Formalization also brought standardization of procedure. Execution days were announced, crowds were managed, guards were assigned. The executioner became one component in a larger machine. He was no longer the focus, the law was. Ironically, this professionalization made the executioner more visible, not less. Everyone knew who he was, because everyone knew the office existed. He was no longer a shadowy figure appearing only at moments of crisis. He was part of the civic landscape, and yet this visibility did not equal acceptance. Being official did not mean being welcome. For now, though, what defined the executioner was not his social standing, but his legal function. He was an officer without honor, a servant without belonging. The law needed him precise, disciplined, and dependable. Everything else would come later, because once a job is defined, it does not stay contained. Roles harden, expectations grow, and eventually, the office begins to shape the life of the man who holds it. That transformation had already begun. By the time the executioner became an official, there was no longer any reason to hide him. In fact, hiding would have undermined the entire point. Medieval justice was not meant to be discreet. It was meant to be witnessed. And so the executioner was never a shadow slipping in and out of crowds. He was a known figure, recognized long before the scaffold was raised. The familiar image of a hooded headsman belongs mostly to later imagination. In the medieval world, masks were unnecessary and even counterproductive. An execution carried authority only if everyone could see that the correct person was doing the killing. An anonymous figure suggested disorder. A known one confirmed legitimacy. The executioner's face mattered because it anchored responsibility. This was not mob violence. This was not revenge carried out in secret. This was justice, and justice required accountability. If something went wrong, everyone needed to know who held the blade. As a result, executioners rarely covered their faces. Contemporary illustrations show bareheaded men wielding axes or swords in full view of the crowd. Chronicles describe them by name. Town records list them as salaried officers. There was no illusion of mystery. Everyone knew exactly who stood on the platform. In some regions, anonymity was actively discouraged. Authorities wanted the executioner identifiable before, during, and after the act. Recognition reinforced the idea that the killing was lawful. It also made the executioner personally responsible for his performance. This visibility extended beyond the scaffold. In many towns, executioners were required to wear specific clothing when on duty. Not theatrical costumes, but clear markers of office. A distinctive cloak, a particular color, sometimes a badge or emblem. These were not honors, they were signals. The purpose was practical. Crowds needed to recognize the executioner instantly. Guards needed to know who could approach the condemned. Officials needed to distinguish him from assistants or bystanders. Confusion was dangerous in an event already charged with tension. Clothing also served a symbolic function. It separated the act of execution from everyday violence. The executioner dressed differently because he was acting differently. He was not a killer in the street. He was the law in motion. Some towns mandated that executioners carry visible tools when traveling to or from an execution. The sword itself became a badge of office. Seeing it told people what was about to happen or what had just occurred. It created anticipation. It also created memory. Children grew up knowing the executioner's face. Vendors recognized him in the marketplace. Travelers learned his name quickly. There was no need to ask who he was. His role announced itself. This constant recognition made secrecy impossible. The executioner could not blend into a crowd even if he wanted to. He was known not because he was notorious, but because his function demanded it. Public recognition extended into legal documentation. Court records often named the executioner explicitly, especially in cases involving nobles or controversial sentences. If disputes arose later, the written record mattered. Who struck the blow? How many strikes were used? Whether procedure was followed. Naming the executioner stabilized the narrative. It prevented rumors from spiraling. If a beheading failed, responsibility could not be diffused. It rested with one known individual. This transparency was intentional. Medieval authorities understood that executions could provoke unrest. Clear identification reduced uncertainty. People might be horrified, but they were less likely to question legitimacy if the process appeared controlled. The executioner's visibility also served as a deterrent. Seeing the same man perform multiple executions reinforced the idea that punishment was systematic, not arbitrary. Crime met consequence, always the same consequence, delivered by the same hand. In smaller towns, this effect was amplified. An executioner might live there for years. Every punishment reinforced his association with authority. Over time, he became inseparable from the concept of justice itself. This is why hooded executioners made little sense in medieval society. Masks belong to secrecy, and secrecy suggests wrongdoing. Medieval justice demanded the opposite. It demanded spectacle anchored in familiarity. The executioner was not a monster emerging from darkness. He was a civic functionary stepping into a role everyone recognized. Even when crowds reacted violently to botched executions, their anger focused on a known individual. This mattered. It meant outrage could be contained. Blame had a target. The executioner's known identity also allowed for correction. If a man proved incompetent, authorities could remove him. If he proved reliable, they could retain him. Evaluation depended on visibility. Some cities even regulated how executioners moved through public spaces on execution days. Routes were prescribed. Timing was fixed. Bells announced his approach. All of this reinforced recognition. Visibility also shaped behavior. Knowing he was watched constantly, the executioner had to maintain composure. Any sign of hesitation, cruelty, or disorder would be remembered. Reputation mattered because it was public. This did not make the role easier. It made it heavier. The executioner carried not just the physical weight of the act, but the knowledge that every movement was observed and judged. There was no moment of anonymity, no release from recognition. The executioner did not step out of his role when the blade was cleaned. Yet at this stage, visibility alone did not define his place in society. Being known was not the same as being shunned. That transformation came later, as rules hardened and boundaries sharpened. For now, what mattered was that the executioner was seen, clearly, consistently, publicly. Justice in the medieval mind could not be invisible, and neither could the man who delivered it. By the time the executioner had become a visible, named officer of the law, something else had quietly begun to harden around him. Not a hood, not a blade, a lineage. What had once been an improvised solution to an unwanted task started turning into something far more permanent. The role stopped passing from hand to hand and began passing from father to son. This was not because families aspired to it. Quite the opposite. The executioner's office became hereditary largely because no one else would take it. Once a man was marked as the town's executioner, his family was marked with him. And once marked, escape was almost impossible. Medieval societies were structured around kinship. Occupations often ran in families, but most trades allowed mobility. A blacksmith's son could become a merchant. A miller's daughter could marry into farming land. Executioners did not enjoy this flexibility. The stain of the role clung not only to the individual but to his bloodline. Authorities found this convenient. A hereditary executioner meant continuity. No need to recruit unwilling criminals. No need to force new men into the role. The son of an executioner was already accustomed to the sight of tools, already familiar with procedure, already separated from respectable society. From the perspective of the courts, it was efficient. From the perspective of the family, it was a trap. In many towns, sons of executioners were informally expected to take up the office whether they wanted to or not. Refusal was rarely punished explicitly, but alternatives were quietly blocked. Other trades refused apprenticeships. Guilds closed ranks. Marriage prospects vanished. The choice was not presented as a command, but as a narrowing corridor. Become what your father was, or become nothing at all. This is how forced inheritance worked, not through law, but through isolation. Once a family entered the executioner caste, it tended to stay there for generations. Records from the late medieval period show executioner dynasties stretching across decades, sometimes centuries. In German-speaking regions especially, names recur in town ledgers again and again, attached to the same office. These were not noble houses, but they were dynasties all the same. Their continuity was defined not by honor but by necessity. Marriage played a crucial role in this process, because executioner families were excluded from most social circles. Their children could not marry freely. Townspeople avoided unions with them out of fear of contamination, misfortune, or simple disgrace. This left a very small pool of acceptable partners. As a result, executioner families married among themselves. Daughters of executioners married sons of executioners from neighboring towns. Cousins married cousins. Entire networks formed across regions, connecting families bound by the same unwanted role. These marriages were practical rather than romantic. They ensured survival within a closed system. Over time, this created social closure. Executioner families became a caste in all but name, not legally defined but socially sealed. Entry was rare. Exit was rarer. The irony is that many of these families became highly skilled precisely because of this isolation. Knowledge was passed down internally. Techniques were refined across generations. Fathers trained sons carefully, knowing mistakes could be fatal not only to the condemned, but to the family's standing. This internal transmission of skill reinforced the idea that executioners were a breed apart. Outsiders saw the same surnames appearing repeatedly and assumed some innate difference. In reality, it was simply the result of exclusion solidifying into heredity. Dynasties began to acquire reputations. Some families were known for clean beheadings, others for efficiency in hanging. These reputations traveled along with the family name, sometimes across borders. A town in need of a new executioner might seek out a known lineage rather than risk an untrained outsider. This further locked families into the role. Their name became their credential and also their cage. Historical examples make this pattern clear. In France, the Sanson family is the most famous, though their prominence peaks later. Even in the medieval period, however, regional executioner families in Normandy and Burgundy maintained continuity over generations. In German lands, cities like Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Frankfurt show similar patterns, with certain surnames attached to the office repeatedly. These families did not simply inherit a job. They inherited a social position with rigid boundaries. Children born into these families grew up knowing their future was constrained. They learned early which streets to avoid, which doors would never open, which lives were closed to them. Education was often informal, handled within the family. Literacy was encouraged only insofar as it served the role. The family unit became insular by necessity. Trust existed inward, rarely outward. Marriages reinforced this inward turn, binding families tighter together while cutting them off, further from the rest of society. Authorities benefited from this arrangement. A hereditary executioner was predictable, loyal, dependent on the town for income and protection. A family with no alternatives was unlikely to rebel or refuse orders. This dependency was not accidental, it was cultivated. In some regions, legal customs even reinforced hereditary succession indirectly. Town councils preferred sons of executioners because they already bore the stigma. Appointing an outsider risked spreading the contamination to a new family. Better to keep it contained. Thus, lineage became policy. The executioner's family, once marginal, became permanently fixed in that margin. They were not slaves, but they were not free. Their future was inherited like property. This inheritance did not bring pride. It brought resignation. Diaries and later accounts hint at this quiet acceptance. Children trained not because they desired the role, but because resisting it was futile. Yet the system endured because it worked. Justice was carried out reliably. The spectacle continued uninterrupted, and society could pretend the violence existed safely outside itself, concentrated in a few marked families. By the late medieval period, the executioner was no longer just an individual performing a task. He was the visible tip of a lineage that could not turn back, a family bound to death not by choice, but by exclusion. And as these dynasties solidified, something else followed inevitably. Rules, restrictions, boundaries that defined exactly how far this inherited role could move within society. Visibility had already set them apart. Lineage ensured they stayed that way. By the time executioner families had become fixed lineages, their separation from ordinary society was no longer just symbolic. It was physical, spatial, written into the geography of medieval towns themselves. You did not need to ask where the executioner lived. Everyone knew. His house was never in the middle of things. It was always just outside. Medieval cities were places of walls and gates, and those boundaries mattered. Inside the walls was order, protection, community, and law. Outside was everything else: fields, gallows, leper houses, burial grounds, and almost without exception, the executioner's home. Town records from across Europe repeatedly placed the executioner's dwelling beyond the city gates or pressed awkwardly against the outer edge of the walls. Sometimes the house stood near the gallows hill, sometimes beside the road where bodies were displayed after death, often near the leper colony or pest house. The logic was simple and cruel. Keep impurity together. If blood and death clung to the executioner, then his presence should not contaminate the civic heart. This was not merely custom. In many towns it was enforced policy. Ordinances specified where the executioner could reside. Housing was often provided by the city, but only in these marginal zones. Free lodging came with isolation baked in. A house you did not choose, in a place no one wanted. Living outside the walls meant practical disadvantages as well. Gates closed at night. Entry required permission. Bad weather cut families off. In times of unrest, executioner households were among the most vulnerable, exposed without the protection of walls. Yet the separation was maintained because proximity mattered more than safety. Inside the city, life revolved around shared spaces, markets, churches, wells, taverns. The executioner was barred from most of them, not always by written law, but by behavior so entrenched it hardly needed words. Markets were technically public spaces, but they operated on unspoken rules. When an executioner entered, stalls closed early, vendors stepped back, hands withdrew from goods. Even when allowed to take food as part of his privileges, the act was tense. Merchants avoided eye contact. Transactions were hurried. The goal was distance. Physical avoidance was constant. People moved aside in the street. Children were pulled away. Brushes of clothing were feared. Touching an executioner was believed to bring bad luck, sickness, or moral stain. This belief was powerful enough to override reason. A crowd would part instinctively, leaving a clear path, as if something contagious were passing through. Church, the center of medieval communal life, offered little refuge. In theory, the executioner was still a Christian. In practice, his presence unsettled sacred space. Many churches restricted where he could stand, often near the door, sometimes behind a screen. In some towns, he was forbidden entry entirely while services were ongoing. The rationale was spiritual pollution. Even lawful killing was thought to stain the soul. The executioner carried the residue of blood into holy places, threatening the purity of the congregation. Allowing him among the faithful was believed to risk divine displeasure. For his family, this exclusion was inherited. Wives and children shared the same restrictions. They attended services at odd hours, or not at all. baptisms and marriages were complicated by reluctance from clergy. Burials were frequently segregated, with executioner families laid to rest in marginal ground. Daily movement required constant negotiation. Entering the city meant being seen. Being seen meant being avoided. Ordinary errands became exercises in endurance. The executioner's family learned which streets emptied quickest, which times were quietest, which routes minimized contact. Social life barely existed. Invitations did not come. Taverns were closed spaces. Bathhouses where communal nakedness erased social difference were especially forbidden. Laws in some regions explicitly barred executioners from using public baths. The risk of shared water was considered too intimate, too dangerous. Even when no law existed, custom enforced the boundary. If an executioner entered a tavern, patrons left, not in protest, in silence. Chairs scraped back, drinks abandoned. The message was unmistakable. This behavior shaped identity. Children raised in these households learned early that they were different, not because they were told, but because they were shown. Every step into town was a lesson in distance. Every empty space around them reinforced it. The phrase untouchable fits uncomfortably well. Not in a legal sense, but in a lived one. Contact was avoided not because of fear of violence, but fear of contamination. The executioner was seen as morally infectious. Proximity itself was suspect. This isolation extended to times of crisis. During plagues, executioner families were sometimes forced even further out, tasked with removing bodies or enforcing quarantines, yet denied the support given to other households. They existed in a paradox: essential during disaster, excluded during peace. Nightfall intensified the separation. Once city gates closed, the executioner's family was locked out unless special permission was granted. This reinforced the sense that they belonged to the outside world, even while serving the inside. Over time, the geography of exile shaped behavior. Executioner homes became self-contained. Gardens replaced markets. Wells replaced public fountains. Skills were learned internally. The family became its own small world because the larger one refused them. What makes this exile especially striking is its ordinariness. There were no dramatic expulsions, no constant violence, just a steady, quiet pushing away. 1,000 small gestures that added up to total separation. The executioner lived close enough to be summoned, far enough to be forgotten. His presence was tolerated only when required. The rest of the time, absence was preferred. And this physical separation laid the groundwork for something deeper. Isolation hardened into rules, rules into law, law into permanent exclusion from civic life. Living outside the walls was not only about where the executioner slept. It defined where he belonged in the social order. As the medieval world became more regulated, this separation would become even more formalized, extending beyond space into every interaction, every rite, every shared moment that defined what it meant to belong. By the time the executioner had been pushed beyond the walls, his value to the city no longer lay in who he was, but in what he could do. Not his presence, not his character, but his hands, his knowledge, his ability to perform acts no one else would touch, yet everyone demanded be done correctly. Execution in the medieval world was not improvisation. It was not rage. It was not chaos. It was a procedure. And like any procedure carried out in public, failure was unacceptable. The most feared moment of any execution was not the death itself, but the mistake. A sword that slipped, a rope tied poorly, a body that refused to die when it was supposed to. Medieval crowds did not attend executions for messiness. They came for resolution, for closure, for the visible completion of justice. Anything less felt wrong, even dangerous. Beheading, often reserved for nobles or high-status offenders, was considered the cleanest death available. But clean did not mean simple. The executioner needed strength, yes, but more than that, precision. The angle of the blade mattered. The height of the block mattered. The stance, the grip, the follow-through. A sword too light would bounce. One too heavy would slow the swing. Axes behaved differently than swords, and each executioner learned the personality of his weapon intimately. There was no margin for error. 1 blow was the ideal, 2 was tolerated, 3 was a scandal. Beyond that the crowd might turn, not against the condemned, but against the man holding the blade. Botched beheadings were remembered, recorded, whispered about long after the blood dried. They suggested incompetence. Worse, they suggested injustice. Executioners practiced relentlessly. Training began long before the first human victim. In families where the role was inherited, sons learned early. They watched, they assisted, they carried tools. They learned to sharpen blades properly, not just to sharpness, but to balance. A blade could be razor sharp and still fail if its weight distribution was wrong. Practice targets were not symbolic, they were practical. Logs, carcasses, livestock, animals whose anatomy approximated the resistance of bone and sinew. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was rehearsal. Muscle memory was everything. In the moment of execution, hesitation could kill the wrong way. Hanging required a different expertise entirely. Contrary to modern assumptions, medieval hanging was rarely designed to break the neck instantly. It was typically strangulation. That meant knot placement mattered. Rope thickness mattered. Drop height mattered. Too low, and the victim lingered for minutes, sometimes longer. Too high, and decapitation could occur, an outcome considered grotesque and dishonorable in many regions. The executioner needed to understand weight, leverage, and time. Assistants often pulled on the legs to hasten death, a grim act sometimes framed as mercy, but even this required coordination. A tangled rope or panicked movement could prolong suffering disastrously. Burnings were worse. Fire was unpredictable. Wind mattered. Wood type mattered. Stack arrangement mattered. The executioner was responsible not only for ignition, but for the sequence of suffering. In some cases, mercy was allowed. Strangulation before flames, a hidden bag of gunpowder. These acts required discretion and technical planning. Fire did not forgive mistakes. Then there was torture. This knowledge was darker still. The executioner was the technician of pain. Courts ordered suffering not as punishment alone, but as a tool for confession. The executioner had to know exactly how far a body could be pushed without killing it, where joints would dislocate before snapping, how long a person could hang by their wrists before losing consciousness, how to revive someone just enough to continue. This was not guesswork. It was accumulated experience. Executioners became, by necessity, experts in anatomy long before anatomy was a science. They knew where arteries lay, which bones broke cleanly, which injuries healed, which did not. They knew pain thresholds not abstractly but intimately. They knew how screaming changed when damage became irreversible. They knew when a body was lying and when it was shutting down. This knowledge was passed quietly, apprentice to master, father to son. It was knowledge no one wanted to acknowledge, yet everyone relied on. Judges issued sentences, but they did not understand bodies. Clergy spoke of souls, but not nerves. The executioner bridged that gap. He translated law into flesh. Precision mattered because executions were read as signs. A clean death suggested rightful judgment. A messy one raised uncomfortable questions. Was the condemned truly guilty? Had God intervened? Was justice flawed? Medieval minds did not separate mechanics from morality. Technique had meaning. This is why training mattered more than mercy. Mercy was optional. Skill was not. A compassionate executioner who lacked precision was worse than a cold one who knew his craft. The city did not want kindness. It wanted certainty. Even the tools reflected this seriousness. Executioner's swords were distinct from battlefield weapons. They had no point. They were not meant to stab, only to cut. Many were engraved with religious phrases, reminders that this act was framed as sacred duty, not murder. Ropes were selected carefully. Hemp behaved differently than flax. New rope behaved differently than old. Stretch mattered. Fray mattered. Executioners inspected equipment obsessively. because equipment failure was public failure. The crowd, often imagined as bloodthirsty, was in fact exacting. They wanted order. They wanted the ritual performed correctly. When it was, silence often followed. When it wasn't, outrage erupted. This pressure shaped the executioner's identity. He could not afford mistakes, not professionally, not socially. His survival depended on competence. His family's survival depended on reputation. And so the executioner became something paradoxical. A master of techniques everyone feared, respected, and refused to learn. A craftsman whose workshop was the scaffold. A specialist whose expertise could not be shared without contamination. These skills were not valued in the marketplace. They earned no guild membership, no apprentices from respectable families, yet they were indispensable. Without them, justice faltered. Authority wavered. The spectacle collapsed. And slowly, as cities relied more heavily on these skills, another transformation began. The executioner's technical mastery started to bleed into other areas. Knowledge of bodies did not stay confined to death. It crept into healing, bone setting, surgery, acts that would blur the line between destroyer and fixer. But that knowledge, and the strange respect it sometimes earned, came later. For now the executioner was defined by mastery alone, by the clean swing, the correct knot, the controlled pain, skills nobody wanted but nobody could do without. The same hands that learned where to cut also learned where to mend. In a world where formal medical training was rare, inconsistent, and often more theoretical than practical, the executioner occupied a strange and deeply uncomfortable overlap between death and healing. He knew the human body not from books, but from experience, from resistance, from failure, from repetition. The same hands that learned where to cut also learned where to mend. In a world where formal medical training was rare, inconsistent, and often more theoretical than practical, the executioner occupied a strange and deeply uncomfortable overlap between death and healing. He knew the human body not from books, but from experience, from resistance, from failure, from repetition. Medieval medicine, as practiced by licensed physicians, leaned heavily on ancient texts, astrology, and theories of humors. Blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Balance, imbalance, celestial influence. Treatments were often abstract, symbolic, or outright dangerous. Executioners, by contrast, dealt with anatomy in the most direct way possible. They knew how bones broke because they had broken them. They knew where joints dislocated because they had pulled them apart. They knew how long a body could survive trauma because they were ordered to keep it alive just long enough. This practical knowledge made them uniquely qualified for a role no one wanted to acknowledge, but many secretly depended on: healer. Bone setting was the most common crossover skill. Dislocations, fractures, crushed fingers, shattered wrists, injuries from labor, accidents, animals, or fights were everyday realities in medieval life. Physicians might prescribe poultices, prayers, or bloodletting. The executioner could reset the bone. He knew leverage. He knew angles. He knew how far to pull before damage became permanent. And crucially, he knew how to act decisively. People who would cross the street to avoid brushing against him might still knock on his door at night with a screaming child, or a mangled arm wrapped in cloth. These visits were often quiet, unrecorded, and unofficial, but they happened everywhere executioners lived. Knowledge of anatomy extended beyond bones. Executioners understood arteries, tendons, and muscle groups with a clarity few others possessed. They had to. A clean beheading required knowing exactly where the neck yielded. Torture required knowing where pain was maximized without killing. Hanging required knowing how airways collapsed. This familiarity translated into a functional, if grim, medical competence. They knew how to cauterize wounds, how to stop bleeding, how to drain abscesses, how to treat old injuries that had healed incorrectly. Many kept collections of remedies, poultices, and salves, learned through trial, error, and observation. Their medicine was not gentle, but it was effective in ways that mattered. This created an extraordinary irony. The man deemed spiritually polluted socially untouchable, was often the most physically capable healer in the community. Franz Schmidt, the executioner of Nuremberg in the late 16th century, provides the clearest window into this world. His diary, unusually detailed and methodical, records not only executions but medical treatments performed over decades. Schmidt executed hundreds of people. He treated thousands. He set bones. He treated wounds. He drained infections. He treated venereal disease. He recorded outcomes carefully, noting successes and failures with the same precision he applied to executions. His writing shows no cruelty, no relish, only documentation, task completed, patient healed, or not. Schmidt himself did not want to be an executioner. He was forced into the role as a teenager after his father accepted the office under duress. Throughout his diary, Schmidt expresses a desire to be remembered not for the deaths he caused, but for the lives he helped. He measured his worth not in executions but in cures. This mindset was not unique. Many executioners framed their medical work as moral counterbalance. If they were condemned to shed blood, then healing became a way to reclaim some sense of righteousness. Some funded masses for the souls of the executed. Others offered free treatment to the poor. These acts did not erase stigma, but they eased conscience. Authorities often tolerated or even encouraged this side work. In some regions, executioners were formally licensed to practice certain forms of healing. Denmark issued such licenses in the late medieval and early modern periods. These licenses often restricted treatment to old wounds, bone injuries, or specific ailments, ensuring executioners did not directly compete with surgeons or physicians while still serving a need. This formal acknowledgement reveals an uncomfortable truth. Executioners were often better at hands-on medicine than those officially trained to practice it. The executioner's medical reputation could spread quietly. Word of mouth mattered more than credentials. A healed child, a reset leg, a stopped infection spoke louder than sermons about impurity. Still, respect remained conditional. Gratitude did not translate into acceptance. Patients did not invite executioners to dinner afterward. There were limits. Executioners were rarely allowed to treat acute battlefield injuries or prestigious patients. They were healers of desperation, not of status. When official surgeons failed, the executioner was the last resort. Their medical knowledge also extended to poisons and antidotes. Familiarity with death made them cautious observers of what caused it. They recognized symptoms. They knew which substances lingered, which acted quickly, which mimicked illness. This knowledge made them valuable in investigations, even as it deepened suspicion toward them. The psychological toll of this dual role was immense. To heal in the morning and kill in the afternoon required compartmentalization few could manage easily. Executioners developed emotional distance not because they were heartless, but because survival demanded it. Feeling too much would have destroyed them. And yet, diaries like Schmidt's reveal humanity beneath the function. Concern for patients, regret for executions, a desire for honor that society refused to grant. This tension defined the executioner's existence. He was proof that medieval society did not neatly separate violence and care. The same system that demanded death also relied on those who understood life's fragility best. Healing with bloodied hands was not a contradiction to medieval people. It was practical, logical. If you know how bodies break, you also know how they mend. But this irony did not soften judgment. Executioners remained outcasts. Their healing was tolerated, not celebrated. Their success did not cleanse them. It merely reminded everyone how dependent they were on someone they refused to accept. And as executioners became more skilled, more indispensable, another layer of contradiction emerged. Their expertise gave them power, quiet power, knowledge power, influence that extended beyond the scaffold and into the daily functioning of the city, which raised an uncomfortable question authorities could no longer ignore. If the executioner was this skilled, this necessary, this embedded in the system, why was he still treated as disposable? That question would shape the next transformation of the role, as executioners began to accumulate not just skills, but privileges. Money changed everything, or at least it complicated it. Once executioners became permanent fixtures of urban justice, towns had to confront an uncomfortable reality. No one would perform this work reliably without compensation that acknowledged both its danger and its social cost. And so across late medieval Europe, the executioner's role slowly acquired a financial structure that was as elaborate as it was resented. The most straightforward payment was the fee per execution. This was not symbolic. It was negotiated, recorded, and enforced. A hanging paid one rate, a beheading another. Burning at the stake paid more, reflecting preparation, duration, and risk of unrest. Breaking on the wheel paid more still. In many cities, these fees equaled weeks or even months of a skilled laborer's wages for a single event. The executioner did not earn money daily. He earned it episodically, in sharp, unforgettable bursts. This payment model created an unsettling arithmetic. The more executions ordered, the more income flowed to the executioner. Authorities were careful to emphasize that executioners did not choose sentences, but resentment among the populace often ignored this distinction. When justice grew harsh, people noticed who benefited financially, even if unfairly. Beyond per-execution fees, many towns provided a retainer or annual salary. This ensured availability and loyalty. The executioner was expected to be on call at all times, ready to act when the court demanded. The salary was compensation for waiting, for stigma, and for the impossibility of pursuing respectable trades openly. Housing was another major economic provision. Executioners were typically granted a house at public expense, often near the gallows, the prison, or just outside the city gate. This was not generosity. It was logistics. The town needed the executioner close but separate. Free housing removed the need for landlords, who might refuse to rent to such a tenant, and ensured the executioner remained geographically isolated. Tax exemptions were common. Executioners were often freed from road tolls, market taxes, and certain civic duties. These exemptions recognized that participation in ordinary civic life was already denied to them. The state compensated exclusion with financial relief. One of the most controversial privileges was the so-called market right, known in various regions by different names. This allowed the executioner to take food and goods from market stalls without payment, within regulated limits. Bread, meat, grain, sometimes drink. The justification was simple. Many merchants refused to sell to executioners, fearing contamination. The privilege ensured the executioner's household could eat regardless of social boycott. In practice, this right bred resentment. Merchants saw it as legalized theft. Executioners were accused of taking more than allowed, of abusing the privilege, of enriching themselves at others' expense. Records show frequent disputes, fines, and clarifications issued by town councils to limit what could be taken and how often. Still, the right persisted because the alternative was hunger or reliance on public charity. Another economic component came from confiscated belongings. By custom, the executioner often claimed the clothing and personal effects of the condemned. This could include boots, cloaks, belts, knives, coins, and jewelry. In a world where clothing was valuable, this was no small matter. Some executioners resold items through intermediaries. Others used them within their household, though this risked drawing attention. In certain jurisdictions, executioners received a portion of confiscated property from convicted criminals, especially in cases of treason or heresy. This varied widely and was tightly regulated, but when allowed, it could be lucrative. The executioner's income thus became entangled with the broader machinery of punishment and confiscation. Side duties expanded economic opportunity further. Executioners were often granted exclusive rights to perform tasks deemed impure. Removing animal carcasses from streets, killing stray dogs, cleaning latrines and cesspits, flaying dead animals, disposing of suicides. Each task came with fees, bounties, or salvage rights. Hides could be sold, fat rendered, bones reused. Even sewage sometimes yielded lost coins. These duties effectively made the executioner a monopolist of filth. No one else wanted the work. The town formalized this by granting exclusive contracts. This arrangement kept the city clean and reinforced the executioner's economic niche. In some regions, executioners collected fees from marginalized populations, women working in brothels, gamblers, vagrants, lepers entering town limits. These collections were sanctioned by authorities and framed as regulatory, though in practice they functioned as taxes levied by an already despised figure. This further deepened resentment while increasing income. Executioners could also earn through transportation duties, escorting prisoners, delivering messages, guarding the gallows site, each task paid separately. Payment schedules preserved in town records show meticulous accounting, down to individual lashes administered during corporal punishment. The economic result was paradoxical. Many executioners lived better materially than ordinary laborers. Their houses were stocked, their families were fed. Their clothing, while stigmatized, was often serviceable and durable. Yet this relative comfort only sharpened hostility. People resented seeing someone so socially despised enjoy financial security. Authorities were aware of this tension and attempted to balance it. Payments were framed as compensation for necessary evil, not reward. Town councils emphasized regulation, oversight, and moral distance. Executioners were paid, but never praised. Privileged, but never honored. This economic framework bound executioners tightly to the state. Their livelihood depended entirely on civic authority. They could not easily leave. They could not easily refuse tasks. Their wealth was conditional and revocable. Prosperity did not translate into autonomy. The system ensured compliance. The executioner's income rose and fell with obedience. A missed blow, a riot, a complaint could mean docked pay or dismissal. Economic privilege came with constant risk, and so the executioner existed within a rigid financial cage, paid enough to endure isolation, privileged enough to survive exclusion, never paid enough to escape the role entirely. The economics were precise, deliberate, and deeply uncomfortable. Money kept the blade sharp. It kept the gallows standing. It kept justice functioning in visible form. But it also ensured that the executioner remained exactly where society wanted him, necessary, compensated, and forever apart. They were paid, trained, regulated, and feared, but none of that answered the question that followed them home at night. Not how to kill, not how much they would earn, not where they were allowed to live, but what it meant to be the person who did this work and then kept breathing afterward. By the late medieval period, the executioner was no longer a temporary solution or a desperate improvisation. He was a permanent fixture, and permanence forced reflection. Medieval Europe was a world soaked in religious meaning. Every action bent towards salvation or damnation. Every profession carried moral weight. For executioners, this weight pressed hardest in silence. Official doctrine insisted they were not murderers. The law declared their actions just. The Church, at least in theory, taught that an executioner who carried out lawful sentences acted as an instrument of earthly justice, not a sinner acting from malice. But theology lived on parchment. Conscience lived in the body. Executioners knew blood intimately. They felt the resistance of muscle and bone. They watched eyes change. They heard crowds cheer and recoil in the same breath. It was impossible to perform this work repeatedly and not wonder where one stood in the universe's moral accounting. Many believed quietly that no argument would spare them judgment. The reassurance of magistrates meant little compared to the dread of standing alone before God with so many lives behind them. This anxiety shows up in small behaviors. Executioners often insisted that the condemned be allowed confession, prayer, or final words, even when crowds grew restless. Some refused to perform an execution if rights were denied, not from mercy, but from fear. Fear that an unshriven soul might cling to them, fear that divine anger would transfer through unfinished ritual. Tools reflected this mindset. Executioners' swords bore inscriptions invoking mercy, salvation, or divine order. Ropes were blessed. Axes were sharpened with ritual care. These were not decorative choices. They were talismans, a way to frame violence as obedience rather than desire. Many executioners donated money to churches they could not enter. They funded masses for the dead, including those they executed. Some paid for candles to burn perpetually for unnamed souls. These acts were rarely publicized. They were not attempts at reputation repair. They were negotiations with eternity. Public hatred complicated everything. Executioners were shunned, insulted, avoided and whispered about. Children were warned away from them. Touching them was believed to bring misfortune. Yet when the law demanded violence, the same mouths that spat insults demanded competence. When pain lingered too long, anger turned instantly toward the executioner, even if the sentence itself had been applauded. This contradiction defined their existence. They were hated for doing what everyone insisted must be done. Their presence repelled people who depended on them absolutely. This tension produced a peculiar self-image. Many executioners came to see themselves as separate from ordinary morality, neither villain nor hero, but something functional, a mechanism, a necessary monster. This self-concept was reinforced by isolation. Living beyond walls, excluded from guilds, barred from normal marriage markets, executioners stopped measuring themselves by social acceptance. Instead, they measured themselves by precision, reliability, and endurance. A clean execution became a moral achievement, not because it spared the condemned, but because it upheld order. Private need eroded public disgust. When bones broke, wounds festered, or pain lingered beyond the skill of physicians, doors opened quietly. Executioners were summoned at night to set limbs, drain abscesses, or treat injuries others would not touch. People who crossed the street by day knocked on executioners' doors by night. These moments mattered. They reinforced a sense of usefulness beyond death. Many executioners wrote later in life that healing gave them relief, not redemption, but balance. Bloodshed paired with restoration, a way to believe they were not entirely defined by destruction. Family life absorbed much of the psychological burden. Children inherited the role not only socially but emotionally. Executioner households became tight, inward-looking units. Shared shame created solidarity. Within the home, the executioner was not feared. He was a father, husband, provider. This private normalcy allowed survival. Why did they endure? Some had no choice. Birth decided their path. Others stayed because leaving meant starvation, exile, or worse. But some endured because the role offered a grim clarity. In a chaotic world, their purpose was unambiguous. They knew what was expected. They knew where they stood, even if it was at the edge. As medieval society edged toward the early modern era, this reckoning deepened. Law grew more centralized. Record-keeping expanded. Executioners left behind diaries, petitions, and appeals. Their voices became clearer. They asked for restored honor, for their children to be freed from inherited shame, for recognition that obedience had a cost. Some succeeded. A few were formally rehabilitated. Families were released from stigma. The role began to professionalize further, losing some of its medieval spiritual framing, but the psychological imprint remained. The executioner carried centuries of fear, faith, and contradiction into the modern world. They were never simply killers. They were men standing at the fault line between justice and violence, absorbing the impact so others could pretend order was clean. They endured because society required them to endure. And because once you become the hand that ends a life in public, there is no path back to being ordinary.